Neville Goddard taught a simple yet radical idea. Your imagination is not escaping reality, it is creating it. When we pretend everything works out, we are not lying to ourselves. We are choosing the state of consciousness from which our future must grow. The world you see around you is not the cause of your inner life, it is the reflection of it. Most people wait for proof before they believe. Neville reversed this order. He taught that belief comes first and proof must follow. When you assume the feeling of success, peace, love, or fulfillment now, your outer world reorganizes itself to match that inner assumption. To pretend everything works out is to live from the end, not toward it. It is to feel relief before the problem disappears, gratitude before the desire arrives, and confidence before the evidence shows up. This is not passive hope, it is active alignment. The moment you stop reacting to appearances and start responding from faith in your inner reality, you reclaim your power. Life stops happening to you and starts happening through you. So today, assume the wish fulfilled. Walk, speak, and think as though it is done. Because in the law Neville taught, what you consistently assume to be true must express itself. Pretend everything works out, not because you're naive, but because you understand how creation works. And it will. Imagination creates reality, because imagination is not merely a faculty for fantasy or daydreaming, it is the creative power that gives form to experience. Neville Goddard insisted that imagination is God in action within the individual, the very source from which all circumstances arise. Most people have been taught to treat imagination as secondary to facts, as something unreliable or childish, yet Neville turned this assumption upside down. He taught that what we call facts are simply crystallized imaginal acts from the past. Every situation, relationship, success, failure, and recurring pattern first existed as an inner assumption before it appeared as an outer condition. Imagination is therefore not an escape from reality, but the womb of reality itself. When you imagine, you are not observing something unreal, you are selecting a state of consciousness. A state is simply a way of being, how you see yourself, what you expect, what feels normal and natural to you. These states exist independently of circumstances, and you move into them through imagination and feeling. The outer world then rearranges itself to mirror the state you occupy. This is why two people can experience the same external conditions yet live entirely different lives. Their imaginal activity, the assumptions they consistently return to, determines what those conditions mean and how they unfold. Imagination works whether you are aware of it or not. Every worry is an imaginal act. Every fear is an imaginal rehearsal of an unwanted future. Every memory you relive with emotion is imagination sustaining a state. Neville emphasized that the law does not judge the content of imagination. It simply expresses it. This is why many people unknowingly create cycles of struggle. They imagine problems more vividly than solutions, failures more consistently than success, and rejection more frequently than acceptance. The world then faithfully reflects these inner pictures, not as punishment, but as obedience to the law. To say imagination creates reality is to accept responsibility for your inner life. This does not mean blaming yourself for everything that happens, but it does mean recognizing where true power lies. Power does not lie in controlling people, manipulating circumstances, or forcing outcomes. Power lies in choosing the assumptions you consent to. The moment you realize that imagining creates, you understand that change must begin inwardly. Trying to fix the outer world without altering inner assumptions is like changing the reflection in a mirror without moving your face. Neville taught that imagination must be united with feeling to become creative. Feeling is not emotion in the dramatic sense. It is the sense of naturalness, the quiet knowing that something is true. When you imagine an outcome and feel it to be real now, you impress the subconscious mind. The subconscious does not reason or argue. It accepts what feels real and projects it outward as experience. This is why forced affirmations often fail, while quiet assumptions succeed. It is not the words that create, but the inner acceptance behind them. From this perspective, pretending everything works out is not denial but selection. You are selecting the state in which things work out and dwelling there internally. The world must then catch up. Neville often said that imagination moves under compulsion to realize itself. Once a state is assumed and persisted in, the bridge of incidents unfolds naturally. You do not need to plan how it will happen. In fact, attempting to control the how often interferes with the process. Imagination knows roads the conscious mind could never predict. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Neville's teaching is the idea that imagination replaces action. It does not. Rather, it precedes and directs action. When imagination changes, action becomes effortless, inspired, and often unconscious. You find yourself saying the right thing at the right time, being in the right place without knowing why, meeting the right people seemingly by chance. These are not coincidences, but coordinated responses to an inner shift. The outer world becomes a stage upon which your imaginal assumptions are acted out. Imagination also determines identity, and identity determines experience. You do not get what you want, you get what you are conscious of being. If you imagine yourself as someone who is chosen, supported, and successful, your behavior subtly aligns with that self-concept. Others respond accordingly. Opportunities appear natural, and obstacles lose their power. Conversely, if you imagine yourself as overlooked, unlucky, or unworthy, even favorable circumstances can turn into disappointments. The same world yields different outcomes based on the imaginal self you occupy. Time itself behaves differently under the law of imagination. What seems distant in linear time can be experienced as immediate in consciousness. When you imagine the end and feel it real, you collapse time psychologically. The future becomes present internally, and the present reorganizes externally. Neville repeatedly emphasized that creation is finished, meaning every possible state already exists. You are not creating something new, but selecting and entering a state through imagination. Once entered, that state must externalize. Doubt arises when appearances contradict imaginal acts. Neville taught that appearances are delayed echoes of past assumptions. If you react emotionally to them, you reinforce the old state. If you remain faithful to the imaginal act despite contradiction, you starve the old state and feed the new one. Faith, in this sense, is loyalty to the unseen reality. It is not blind belief, but disciplined imagination. You persist not because you are forcing optimism, but because you understand the law well enough to trust its operation. Imagination is most powerful when the mind is relaxed. This is why Neville recommended entering a drowsy, meditative state before imagining. In this condition, the critical faculties of the conscious mind soften, and impressions pass more easily into the subconscious. However, imagination is not limited to formal sessions. Every idle thought, every inner conversation, every assumption about how things usually go is imaginal activity. The goal is not to imagine occasionally, but to live imaginatively, to think from the end as a way of being. Living imaginatively changes how you interpret events. Challenges become temporary rearrangements rather than final verdicts. Delays become part of the bridge rather than signs of failure. Even negative experiences lose their emotional grip because you no longer see them as ultimate reality. You see them as shadows cast by former assumptions. This detachment is not apathy, it is confidence. You know where you are going internally, so you are not shaken by what appears externally. When Neville said imagination creates reality, he was also pointing to unity. There is not an inner world and an outer world competing for dominance. There is one continuous movement of consciousness expressing itself. The inner is cause, the outer is effect. Understanding this restores a sense of order and meaning to life. Nothing is random. Nothing is wasted. Every experience is feedback, showing you what state you have been occupying. This understanding transforms relationships as well. Others reflect the assumptions you hold about them and yourself in relation to them. Change the imaginal story, and the relationship must change. Neville famously taught that there is no one to change but self. This does not mean others have no autonomy. It means that your experience of others is filtered through your imagination. When you imagine harmony, respect, and love, you invite those qualities into expression. Imagination also dissolves fear of failure. If reality is responsive rather than fixed, then no circumstance is permanent. You can always assume a new state. The past loses its authority, and the future becomes flexible. This does not make you reckless, it makes you resilient. You stop identifying with mistakes and start identifying with possibility. Even setbacks become redirections rather than dead ends. Ultimately, to accept that imagination creates reality is to reclaim authorship of your life. You stop seeing yourself as a character reacting to a script written by chance or fate. You become the writer, choosing the tone, direction, and outcome through inner assumption. Pretending everything works out is simply choosing to write from the ending you desire instead of the conflict you fear. Neville's teaching is deceptively simple, yet profoundly demanding. It requires vigilance over inner life, discipline in thought, and courage to trust the unseen. But its reward is freedom, the freedom to live from possibility rather than limitation, from faith rather than fear. When you truly grasp that imagination creates reality, you no longer ask whether something is possible. You ask only whether you are willing to assume it. And once you assume it fully, reality has no choice but to agree. Living from the end means adopting the inner posture of fulfillment before any outer evidence appears. Neville Goddard taught that the moment you assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, creation is complete. What remains is not effort, struggle, or anxious waiting, but allowance. Most people live their lives moving psychologically toward their desires, always in a state of becoming, hoping that one day circumstances will grant them permission to feel complete. Neville reversed this pattern by teaching that you must feel complete first, and circumstances will follow. To live from the end is to mentally relocate yourself into the future you desire and occupy it as a present fact. This does not involve visualizing endlessly or emotionally forcing happiness. It involves a quiet shift in identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who wants and begin seeing yourself as someone who has. The inner dialogue changes, the expectations change, and the emotional baseline changes. Instead of asking, "How will this work out?" you naturally think, "Of course it did." That subtle assumption governs your reactions to life. Most frustration comes from living in the middle, from constantly checking reality to see if it has caught up with your desire. This habit reinforces the state of lack. Every time you look to the outer world for confirmation, you are declaring inwardly that you do not yet have what you want. Living from the end requires trust in the unseen and restraint from compulsive monitoring. It is an inner discipline that says, "I know how this ends, so I will not be disturbed by temporary appearances." Neville emphasized that the end you live from must be definite. Vague hope produces vague results. When you clearly define the end and accept it as done internally, your subconscious receives a precise instruction. This instruction then orchestrates events in ways the conscious mind could never design. The bridge of incidents unfolds naturally, often through ordinary, even mundane events that seem unrelated at first. Only in hindsight do you recognize the intelligence of the process. Living from the end also means releasing the need to control the path. Many people sabotage their imaginal acts by trying to micromanage how their desire should arrive. This creates tension and doubt. Neville taught that once the end is assumed, your only responsibility is fidelity to that assumption. The how, the when, and the who belong to a deeper intelligence. When you live from the end, action becomes intuitive rather than forced. You move when moved, speak when inspired, and rest when rest is needed. Emotionally, living from the end feels like relief. It is the absence of urgency. It is the calm that comes when a problem is already solved. You may still experience human emotions, but they no longer define your state. Temporary disappointment does not turn into despair, and delays do not turn into panic. You are anchored in the outcome rather than tossed around by the process. This emotional stability is not detachment from life, but deeper engagement with it, because you are no longer consumed by fear. One of the most practical signs of living from the end is the change in inner conversations. Neville taught that inner speech is the most powerful form of imagination. When you live from the end, you no longer rehearse explanations of why something hasn't happened yet. You no longer argue mentally with absent people or relive past failures. Instead, your inner dialogue assumes resolution. You think from success, from harmony, from fulfillment. These conversations, though silent, shape your outer world more powerfully than spoken words. Living from the end also alters your sense of self-worth. Wanting implies unworthiness, having implies entitlement. When you assume the end, you implicitly accept that you deserve it. This quiet acceptance dissolves resistance. Many people fail not because they cannot imagine success, but because they cannot imagine themselves as the kind of person who naturally has it. Living from the end is an identity shift as much as a mental exercise. Neville warned against confusing living from the end with pretending in a superficial or performative way. It is not about convincing others, posting affirmations, or acting happy while feeling anxious inside. It is an inward acceptance that does not require external validation. In fact, the less you talk about it, the more stable the state becomes. The imaginal act thrives in silence and confidence, not in explanation or defense. Time often feels distorted when you live from the end. Days may pass without obsession, and then suddenly events accelerate. This is because psychological time has shifted. You are no longer waiting, so there is no sense of delay. Waiting belongs to the state of lack. Fulfillment has no urgency. When you live from the end, you are psychologically at rest even while life continues to move. Challenges will still arise, but they are interpreted differently. Instead of seeing obstacles as signs of failure, you see them as part of the rearrangement. Neville taught that every assumption carries with it a bridge of incidents, and not all incidents will look pleasant. Some may even appear to contradict your desire. Living from the end means refusing to judge the process. You remain faithful to the outcome, even when the path looks strange. Living from the end also requires letting go of the old story. You cannot occupy two states at once. Every time you return mentally to the past, recount old disappointments, or identify with former limitations, you re-enter the old state. Neville emphasized that you must die to the old self to be reborn into the new one. This death is psychological, not physical. It is the refusal to give emotional life to what no longer serves your chosen end. The simplicity of living from the end is what makes it difficult. The mind wants to do more, to fix, to analyze, to intervene. But the law operates through being, not doing. When you live from the end, you are not passive, you are aligned. Action arises naturally from alignment. Effortless action always outperforms forced action because it is synchronized with the assumed state. Living from the end transforms patience into certainty. You are no longer patient because you are waiting, you are patient because you know. This knowing is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, steady, and resilient. It does not need reinforcement. It does not collapse under doubt. It simply persists. Neville taught that persistence is not repetition of technique, but persistence in state. You do not need to imagine the end 1,000 times if you stop contradicting it mentally throughout the day. Living from the end means carrying the feeling of completion into ordinary moments, into how you walk, how you speak, how you respond. Life becomes the expression of your assumption rather than a test of it. Ultimately, to live from the end is to trust yourself at the deepest level. It is to believe that your consciousness is creative and that your assumptions matter more than appearances. When you truly live from the end, life feels less like a struggle and more like a confirmation. Events unfold not to convince you, but because you are already convinced. In Neville's teaching, living from the end is not a technique to get things, it is a way of life. It is choosing to inhabit the version of yourself for whom things work out and allowing the world to reorganize accordingly. When you live from the end, fulfillment is not something you chase. It is something you remember. Assumption precedes proof because reality is not a fixed structure that you discover, but a responsive field that confirms what you consistently accept as true. Neville Goddard taught that the outer world is a mirror, and like any mirror, it cannot reflect what you do not first present to it. Proof does not initiate belief, belief initiates proof. This reversal of cause and effect is the foundation of conscious creation. Yet it is also the point where most people struggle, because it requires faith in an unseen process rather than dependence on visible evidence. From childhood, people are conditioned to trust their senses above all else. You are taught to believe what you see, hear, and touch, and to doubt what cannot be immediately verified. Neville challenged this conditioning by asserting that the senses show only the effects of past assumptions. When you wait for proof before believing, you remain trapped in the past, reinforcing the very conditions you wish to change. Assumption precedes proof because assumption is the cause, and proof is the delayed effect. An assumption is not a hopeful thought or a fleeting wish. It is an idea you have accepted as fact, even quietly, even unconsciously. It feels natural, ordinary, and unquestioned. These assumptions form the framework through which you interpret life. Two people can receive the same information and draw entirely different conclusions because their assumptions differ. One assumes opportunity, the other assumes threat. The world then confirms each assumption with corresponding experiences. Neville emphasized that what feels natural to you is what you will experience. This is why affirmations that feel forced or unbelievable often fail. They do not become assumptions because they lack emotional acceptance. Proof does not appear because the inner state has not truly changed. When an assumption is fully accepted, it no longer feels like something you are trying to make happen. It feels like something that simply is. At that point, proof becomes inevitable. Waiting for proof is often disguised as being practical or realistic. In truth, it is a form of doubt. It says, "I will believe when I see," which keeps you bound to present conditions. Neville taught that faith is not belief without reason, but belief in advance of evidence. It is understanding the law well enough to trust that inner conviction must eventually express itself. Faith is loyalty to your assumption, even when appearances contradict it. The delay between assumption and proof is where discipline is required. During this interval, the outer world may show you the opposite of what you have assumed. This is not failure, it is the echo of previous beliefs. If you react emotionally to these echoes, you give them renewed life. If you remain inwardly faithful to your new assumption, you starve the old one. The world must then adjust to the dominant assumption you sustain. Neville often spoke of persistence, but not as effort or repetition. Persistence means continuing to accept the assumption as true. It is a refusal to negotiate with appearances. This does not mean denying reality in a reckless way. It means recognizing what level of reality has creative authority. The inner world is cause, the outer world is effect. Once this hierarchy is understood, it becomes easier to remain steady in your assumption. Assumption precedes proof also explains why sudden changes can occur without gradual buildup. When an assumption shifts decisively, the outer world can reorganize rapidly. What appears as a miracle is simply the natural result of a new dominant belief. Neville insisted that nothing is impossible to the imagination because imagination is not bound by linear progression. Proof may appear quickly or slowly, but it must appear once the assumption is fixed. Many people unintentionally assume failure, delay, or disappointment even while consciously desiring success. They assume that things are hard, that they are unlucky, or that good outcomes are rare. These assumptions feel so natural that they go unnoticed. The world then faithfully supplies evidence to support them. Understanding that assumption precedes proof allows you to uncover and replace these hidden beliefs, rather than blaming circumstances or other people. Inner conversations are one of the clearest indicators of assumption. What you say to yourself when no one is listening reveals what you believe to be true. If your inner dialogue is filled with explanations, justifications, and defenses, you are likely assuming lack or conflict. When the assumption changes, inner conversations change effortlessly. You no longer rehearse disappointment because it no longer fits your self-concept. Proof follows this shift automatically. Assumption also governs emotional reactions. You do not react to events themselves, but to what you assume they mean. The same delay can produce anxiety in one person and calm certainty in another. The difference lies in assumption. When you assume success, delays are temporary. When you assume failure, delays are confirmations. Proof aligns with whichever interpretation you consistently accept. Neville taught that imagination plus assumption creates conviction, and conviction hardens into fact. This process does not require force. In fact, force often indicates disbelief. When you truly assume something, you do not feel the need to convince others or constantly reassure yourself. There is a quiet confidence that allows you to live normally while expecting differently. This neutrality is often mistaken for indifference, but it is actually certainty. Assumption precedes proof in relationships as well. How others treat you reflects what you assume about yourself and about them. If you assume respect, you behave in ways that invite it, and others respond accordingly. If you assume rejection, even neutral behavior can feel like confirmation. Changing the assumption changes the dynamic without confrontation or manipulation. This is why Neville insisted that there is no one to change but self. The fear of disappointment often prevents people from assuming boldly. They believe that withholding belief will protect them from pain. Neville taught the opposite. Withholding assumption prolongs suffering. To assume is to risk, but it is also to create. The law does not reward caution, it responds to conviction. When you dare to assume, you activate the creative process. When you hesitate, you remain in stasis. Assumption precedes proof also frees you from dependence on external authority. You no longer need permission, validation, or guarantees to believe in a desired outcome. Your inner acceptance becomes the only requirement. This autonomy is deeply empowering. It shifts the source of certainty from the world to the self. Life becomes something you participate in consciously rather than endure passively. Over time, as assumptions consistently harden into facts, trust in the law grows. You begin to see patterns, to recognize how quickly the world mirrors inner shifts. This builds confidence not in specific outcomes, but in the process itself. You no longer fear uncertainty because you understand how reality responds to belief. Proof becomes expected rather than surprising. Ultimately, to accept that assumption precedes proof is to live as a conscious creator rather than a reactive observer. You stop asking what life will show you and start deciding what you will accept as true. You understand that the world is always saying yes, but it can only say yes to what you assume. When that assumption is chosen deliberately and sustained calmly, proof is not a question of if, but when. In Neville Goddard's teaching, assumption is the unseen seed and proof is the visible harvest.